You are listening to the Love Unplugged podcast, episode 104. Often we are so focused on the end goal, that destination, that we miss the joy, the lessons, and the amazing wins of the journey itself. There is so much to be experienced in the journey of creating a business, and today we are learning directly from a successful, multi-passionate woman who is sharing the golden nuggets of wisdom that she has learned along the way. I cannot wait for you to hear today's chat, so without further ado, let's get to it. Hey there, I'm your host, Jessica Fergon, and I am passionate about doing the inner work needed to reach your goals. Let me be your guide as we navigate all the fears and insecurities that surface when it's time to step outside of your comfort zone. Along with my knowledgeable guests and industry experts, I'm here to teach you how to reawaken your life purpose and passion and create the steps to turn your intentions into action. Ultimately, my goal is to empower you to rise above those blocks holding you back and start living a life that you are worthy and deserving of. So come on, it's time to slow down, find a comfy spot with your favorite organic tea, and get inspired. Thank you for tuning in to the Love Unplugged podcast. Hello, loves. Today I am joined by the lovely, multi-passionate Sarah Davidson, co-founder of organic matcha green tea company Matcha Maiden, creative force behind Spoonful of Sarah, where she shares her entrepreneurial journey, and host of the podcast Seize the Yay. And now she is also an author of a new book called Seize the Yay as well. And we're going to learn all about her entrepreneurial journey and about her podcast and her new book. But before we start, I just want to welcome you, Sarah. I'm just so honored to have you as my guest. And I'm so excited to learn all about your story and advice. But before we start, for those that don't know you yet, I would love for you to share a little bit more about you personally.
Oh, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. That's so kind of you, and really, really lovely to be here and to connect with you too. Gosh, as you mentioned, I'm multi-passionate. I think that's I'm totally stealing that from you. No one's actually ever used that word to describe me, but that's so perfect. I think the best way to describe myself these days is as a lawyer turned funtrepreneur. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I started off my career as a corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer, so a very different context to where I am now, but made the jump into business with my now husband, Nick, and we've started a couple of businesses together, which led to the Seize the Yay podcast, which then led to the Seize the Yay book. So on a constant journey of discovering my yay, what lights me up, what brings me joy, what helps bring others joy. We have a beautiful golden retriever called Paul, who might make an appearance at some point. He tends to love to jump onto these podcasts. I guess the other thing that I don't often start with, but that is kind of a defining part of the story is I am South Korean. I was born in South Korea, but adopted when I was 6 months old and came to Melbourne and was brought up by an incredible Australian country bumpkin family who are totally Caucasian. So I'm actually a bogan Australian in my brain, but a fully blown Asian on the outside, which is made for a really fun and interesting identity. But yeah, left me, I think, with a very keen sense of appreciation for sliding doors moments and making the most of this beautiful life that we have.
Amazing. Let's start at the very beginning with your career as a lawyer. When did you realize that profession and lifestyle just wasn't for you?
Yeah, that's, I think, one of my most beloved things to talk about, because I think a lot of people find themselves in the position that I was, where I chose law more as a default, more out of not knowing what else I wanted to do than because I actually wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't one of those kids who was, obsessed with the law as a young child, or who always wanted to sort of put on a suit and get in court. It was more because I've always had such a fascination in lots of different things that I sometimes think when you have lots of different interests, it's actually really hard to find a passion because you're interested in so many different things that it's hard to make a choice. So I've always been equal parts arty-farty and nerdburger. I've loved the arts. I was a ballerina first. I loved dancing and drawing and writing, and I wrote songs and plays when I was young. But then I also loved the really nerdy academic side of maths and science. And by the end of school, I hadn't figured out, I've always done a really broad range of subjects. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. So I just worked as hard as I could and then got the marks for law and figured that that would keep more doors open than close them. And then by the time I finished uni, I did the same thing. I did arts law, so I could do both the really academic side and the really creative side. And again, decided I'm not going to know, I'm not any clearer on what my pathway in life is, but at some point I've got to start applying for jobs. So I just started applying for corporate law firms because, again, I thought, what's going to keep more doors open than close them? And when I actually ended up getting into a really, really good law firm that is very well known internationally. And it was, without a doubt, even though I didn't stay in that career, the best platform and best launchpad for what's come next that I ever could have wished for. I learned so much. I got the opportunity to work under some seriously intelligent people and just figure out how full-time work actually feels and what the market looks like. And I learn about shares and, you know, companies and business and all these things that I just had no idea about at uni. But I also found that because it was objectively successful and objectively a worthy career path, like people think of law as really respectable. They think you're sort of really killing it if you've got a good fancy job in the city and you've got like an office on, you know, an office on the 50th floor. And even though I've never really been motivated by metrics like that, and I've always been much more intrinsically motivated by creativity, I got very distracted. So everyone often talks about, like, when did you know law wasn't for you? I actually never came to that realization. I never went, oh God, I hate this. This is not for me. I'm not fulfilled. I never got there. I was so blinded by the opportunity and the gratitude, and particularly with the background I've come from, being so lucky to be in Australia and to have these opportunities always made me almost over grateful, so that I would be so appreciative to just have a job that I would never consider anything else. So I'd also just come out of the GFC. I was at uni applying for all these jobs when pretty much all graduate programs were shutting down. Like, I knew how hard it was to get that position, that for the first few years, I was just totally satisfied by being busy, being successful on the outside, climbing ladders, getting paid, wearing suits. And what I now look back and realize and actually get goosebumps over is that I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't happy either. I was just fine. I was just coasting along thinking, maybe this is all there is. Like, maybe this is what you actually feel when you're happy. And it's because I had nothing else to compare it to. That was the only job I'd ever had. So I just kind of went with it and thought, oh, I'm really lucky, so, you know, I should make the most of it, which is not a bad attitude to have. But now I realize people won't make a change unless they're actively unhappy. So if you're desperately unhappy in a job, and if you did wake up in a law firm one day and realize it wasn't for you, you're probably going to make a change because there's a motivation. You're so you're disadvantaged, or you're uncomfortable there, so you'll leave. If you're just blah, you'll probably stay comfortable and you probably won't change. So I was just blah. And I think if nothing else had happened, I would probably have stayed there for many, many years, maybe even decades, before I realized I was just being distracted by how gratifying it is to be busy. So it was only a happy accident that actually pulled me out of that mindset and broke the autopilot circuit that showed me, by contrast, what I was missing out on. And that's what made me realize, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I wasn't satisfied. I didn't even know that this wasn't the right thing for me until, this is such a long story, but I ended up in all places in Rwanda in Africa. So my husband has a creative agency. He'd been working on this huge campaign, and the proceeds went to this school in Rwanda, and we got to go as sponsors to visit and spend a month in this school. And two things happened on that trip. The first thing was probably the first time I'd ever reflected on happiness and what it meant. I thought success was happiness. I didn't really realize there were different concepts that have to come from different things. And it was because I saw the children over there, and I thought, you know, everyone thinks you're going to go to, you know, underprivileged countries and have this huge wave of gratitude for where you are in the West. What actually happened is I saw pure happiness in the children who had nothing, playing with leaves for 12 hours and being fascinated by something so simple. And then I think of the children back home who have everything and who are anxious about it all and like constantly unhappy and not feeling like they have enough. And, we create all these problems to be anxious about and then use more problems to solve them. We're like constantly on emails and just getting overconnected and stressed out. Whereas these people with very little were so joyous, they would break out into song. So it was my first real reflection on happiness and what is life about. And the next thing that happened was I brought home a gut parasite, and it was very subtle, but I was so detached from wellness that I had absolutely no idea, kept working 20-hour days, eating at my desk. I'd sort of eat a broccoli and think, I was well, like that was wellness, tick. And I slowly started to like burn out. I lost 15 kilos from the gut parasite without realizing. And I actually collapsed at work with adrenal fatigue and had to take months off work to recover before I realized that something was wrong. And it was only in the process of healing, I was banned from coffee because my body was so fragile, I couldn't have it without having a panic attack, that I discovered matcha powder, and that it's a beautiful caffeine alternative that still gives you a buzz because it has a lot of caffeine, like half the amount of coffee, but it slow releases into your bloodstream so that if you're unwell or if you're caffeine sensitive, you can tolerate it much better than coffee. And the whole business idea just came out of coming back to Australia. I discovered it in Asia when I was working on a deal over there, came back to Australia, couldn't find it anywhere. Out of selfish needs, a business idea was born, and that's how it all started, the now infamous happy accident.
Wow. That's
there is no
quite
short way to tell that story.
Wow, your life is so fascinating.
It's random for sure.
That's so crazy. Just so many things on that I want to touch on. It's insane because I was creative, but then also studied law in school, and I always did really well in law. So I just naturally felt like that was the direction that I needed to go into as well, just because it was the grades that I was getting were better than all the other classes and whatnot that I was taking. So I just naturally progressed into that industry. I didn't get to lawyer, but I was working towards like a paralegal or something. And then I realized that it just wasn't for me either, that industry. It just wasn't something that aligned with what I truly wanted. But I love that you brought up the fact that even though it wasn't your career that you wanted in the end, you learned so much and you appreciated the experience because like all these experiences that you were having, these people that you were working with, they taught you so much. They were able to bring so much to the table that you can take into your other career paths down the road, which I think is just so important for people to realize that you may not be in a job that you fully love right now, but there might be learning opportunities that you can take into your entrepreneurial journey or whatever you choose to do afterwards, that you should never overlook what you're currently doing. Always trying to find what you can learn from that opportunity. Even though you don't like it, there's something there that you can benefit from.
Absolutely. And I almost think, especially if you don't like it, then it's even more, there's even more motivation to make sure, well, at least you're going to learn something from it. And I think we're very preoccupied with needing to know what the benefit is of every single thing we do. Otherwise, we think it's a waste of time, which is also, I think, why we have so much trouble resting, because we don't see that there's like an immediate gratification or benefit from that activity. We're not like actually getting results. But I have to keep coming back every time to remind myself, but also other people, that every single experience is teaching you something. Whether you enjoy it or not, it's happening to you to give you some skill, or to even to tell you what you don't like. That's as valuable a piece of information. Like, there are plenty of people out there who don't know anything about what they like or don't like. So even if you go into a job and realize it's not for you, that's a piece of the puzzle that you're putting together. That's teaching you what to not go for next time. And it's also like, you can't rush to the end. The quote that I always come back to is, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step. And that goes so actively against everything in this day and age. We want to race to the end. We want to get in the lift and just get straight there. But if you did get there straight away, you wouldn't be prepared. You wouldn't have learned any of the stuff that you actually needed to learn from all the chapters in between. And what my podcast is about is going through in painful detail all the chapters of people's lives who seem really successful now, who you so often forget had to go through a million steps that they hated or that weren't the one that they wanted to end up in before they got to where they did. And they wouldn't have been able to fast forward there because without the lessons from all the other kind of, stepping stones, you wouldn't be who you are. So patience and willingness to learn from every chapter, whether it's one you like or not, is something I've really valued as a lesson and hope to share with many other people.
100%. I just love that. Now, I'm surprised with matcha. I've never had matcha myself. I always thought that it was really highly
Wow.
caffeinated because I'm super sensitive to caffeine. So, like you were saying, if your adrenals are depleted and things like that, you probably shouldn't be having caffeine. You need to repair them and whatnot. So I try to stay away from a lot of caffeine products. Even tea, like black tea, will get me all jittery and whatnot. But the fact that you were
Wow.
saying that matcha slow releases, maybe I will give that a try.
Yeah, it's got a unique amino acid in it called L-theanine, which is unique to green tea leaves. So it's a very special type of amino acid that does make the caffeine release over 3 to 4 hours. And that's why matcha actually came to prominence through Zen Buddhist monks, because they would use it when they had to do multi-hour meditations and keep energy, but a sustained energy, not like a chaotic kind of spike and crash. And the energy that you can imagine monks over many, many hours of just sitting still, but that they need to not fall asleep in, that's the kind of energy that you would want during the day. You wouldn't necessarily want the hit of coffee. You would want something that sustains you over quite a longer amount of time. So I love that that's its origins, because that's now why I think we've become so passionate about changing people's perception of it as this really old school, traditional, requires a whole tea ceremony with all this choreography to actually drink. Now I'm bring it into the modern context. We're all about more natural forms of energy. We're all about ways to supplement our lives in a really efficient form that gives you a massive dose of energy and antioxidants, but doesn't require a lot of preparation or equipment, and that you can just throw into your smoothies. And we wanted to bring it into the modern day, make it really accessible, and not make you go into a really specialist Japanese grocery to get it. We wanted it to be on health food shelves and in beauty aisles and a lifestyle product rather than just an old-fashioned tea.
Oh, that's so great. Now, okay, so you started Matcha Maiden following recovering from that bacteria that you had. Now, did you go back to being a lawyer? Did you go back to work and then have Matcha Maiden going as a side hustle at the time, or did you quit the lawyer career and then start full time with Matcha Maiden?
That's such a great question. I think I would have wanted to jump straight away. As soon as you have a good idea, again, we want to jump to the end, and we want to just we're not very patient with making a decision and then waiting for things to happen. But as much as I'm such a proponent of seizing the yay, taking a jump when you found what you love, I did stay for another 6 months because it totally was a side hustle. Firstly, we didn't actually even think of it as a business. It was more just to sell. So we bought 10 kilos. It turned up, it was just for us. It was so much powder. And the
Yes.
main goal was just to get rid of some of it. I don't think we ever considered that we reorder. I think we just thought we'd start this business for that 10 kilos. And then it just happened to go so well that we ended up turning it into a business. But the original idea was just sell 1 or 2 bags. And now I've actually tried to replicate that decision-making process of, when I start something new, only think about how to sell one product, because otherwise you'll get too overwhelmed. Just focus on the immediate next step to get one product ready, because if you get one product ready, you can have 10 products ready. If you
Mm-hmm.
have 10 products ready, you can have 100 products ready. But if you think about getting it ready for 100 or 1,000, you'll get so overwhelmed and scared and doubt yourself so much that you probably won't start. So I think that hobby nature of it actually is what allowed us to start, because we didn't take it seriously. I still had a job. It wasn't going to be my, there wasn't that pressure and risk of making it work. And because of that, we did sort of approach it with that done is better than perfect mindset. Like, just get it up, knock up a little website, have a bit of fun, but it doesn't need to be perfect. No one's going to see it. It's going to be fine. It's going to be our friends and family. We knocked it all up in a weekend, went on, literally on eBay to get the stickers, on Alibaba to get the heat sealer. Like, everything was so DIY. We packed it in a friend's commercial kitchen just in our undies because it was so hot in Melbourne at that time. And it was like Breaking Bad but green. It was so bad. It was just so like DIY and not glamorous and not official and so just knocked together. But because that is all you need, once we sold one bag, we already had the setup to sort of sell 100 bags. And very quickly, within 7 days of launching, it completely sold out. And so suddenly we were like, oh my God, we actually need to order more stock because we've put this out there as a business and now it actually is one. And now we have to do something with it. But at the same time, it was still not big enough to even consider sustaining, like replacing my wage until 6 months later. So I stayed because I could, your business is not necessarily going to have enough work for you to go full time straight away. So there's so much to be said for waiting and keeping a foot in both doors for as long as you possibly can, because we needed money to buy the stock. We needed money to buy the bags and the stickers. And my wage was like our capital injections every time. So I did both as long as I possibly could until we ended up getting into Urban Outfitters across the States, which was so random. Again, just goes to show that when you keep an open mind, you really can stumble into opportunities you never thought were possible. Because at the time, the digital landscape has been so incredible at democratizing influence and democratizing good ideas. If it looks fancy and polished on the outside, Urban Outfitters didn't know that it was just a couple in their undies in a garage. It looked like a proper business with a shop front and with a brand and a logo and a beautiful Instagram and lots of photos. And it seemed, for all intents and purposes, like it was proper, which is why I'm such a proponent of fake it till you make it. And they pretty much ordered, they wanted custom small sized bags for their lifestyle and beauty section, which they have sort of at the checkout. And because we weren't a big business, we could just say yes. We're like, sure, we'll just buy smaller bags and pack it in smaller bags. Like, who's going to tell us no? And it was for more bags than we'd sold in the whole 6 months. And that was really crunch time, because that was when either I would leave my job to pack because we didn't have a packer. So I would have to physically spend 24 hours a day packing until the due date to get the order in, or we'd have to say no. And I was like, am I prepared to say no to Urban Outfitters? Like, the best opportunity beyond our wildest dreams has just arrived on my doorstep. How do I say no to that? And of course, my initial reaction was to say no, because the certainty and stability and respectability of a legal job is, paramount. But I really come back to that idea of what is the once in a lifetime opportunity. And my legal career will always be there. I might be a few years behind my colleagues, but lawyers will never not be needed, just like taxes will never not be charged. Like, they're two constants in life. But I will almost never have the chance to be one of the first to market and to take up this opportunity at Urban Outfitters. If we'd waited 6 months to think about whether or not it was a good idea, there would be 10 more matches, which is actually what happened. Within 6 months, we went from having no competitors to having like 100 just pop up out of nowhere. But by then we'd already locked in contracts with so many of the big suppliers. So that was the moment of, oh my gosh, fork in the road. I've got to make a big decision, and I haven't looked back. I resigned the next day.
That's amazing. Did you have any fears or doubts that you had to kind of work through and be like, okay, I need to like overcome this. I need to rise above it and just go for it?
Absolutely. I was more racked with self-doubt than I ever had been, because I'd been doing a job that I had 7 years of training for. Like, I couldn't have been more prepared and ready. And then even when I did get into the workforce, I had a senior associate, an associate, a partner. Like, there were so many bosses that you could turn to when you didn't know what was happening. In business, I had absolutely no idea. I had no training. I had no boss. I had no resources or no mentor. And the self-doubt continues to this day to be real. It's something that is your biggest barrier. The barrier isn't whether or not your product or service will go well. It's not whether or not you'll be able to do it. It's not your skills. It's not the technology. It's literally everything in your mind. I think more businesses don't happen or don't get off the ground because of the person doubting their own ability than the fact that they tried and it didn't work. And more than any other challenge we've had, it's been getting through it and being able to acknowledge that even now, I sort of thought by now I'd feel confident. I thought by now I would realize that with 6 years under our belt, it has gone well and there is a bit of evidence. And obviously it's less strong, but I've learned to interpret self-doubt actually just as a really positive sign that you're doing something out of the comfort zone. It's what your body does as just a natural protective mechanism to be like, this is new, this is a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit scary, but that means you're doing something that you're not familiar with, that's not comfortable, that's not just coasting and never evolving. But the big trick is, once you acknowledge it, be able to sort of observe it, but not necessarily believe everything it tells you. So rather than going, okay, I feel the self-doubt, oh, it's probably right, I'm probably a failure, I'm probably not good enough for this, go, okay, I've acknowledged the self-doubt, I'm going to put it aside now, I see that it's useful, but now I'm going to push through it anyway. And that single strategy and technique is what's continued to allow me to do things I never thought I'd be able to do, just simply by being able to see self-doubt not as a bad thing, but also not as a true thing, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. Do you have any other advice for those that are looking to trust their guts and to take that leap of faith and go full time and quit that career or that job that they have that financial security with, and take that side hustle to full time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one is that when you're in that crucial step, you won't probably have had that much practice at that point in your life in making those big decisions that trigger such self-doubt and comparison and fear. So the best thing you can do is make sure that in the moments where you're going to freak out and think it's all a mistake, that you surround yourself with people who are only going to pursue, like only going to help you towards your goal. So I always say you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I truly believe that the people you turn to in those crucial moments either turn you one way or the other. And if I had asked my legal friends, I would never have left, because they can only think that way. They can only think about things in terms of certainty and stability and 5-year plans and stable incomes. Like, that's what they're trained to do. So I made sure that if I was feeling a little bit wobbly, I only asked people who had done it before, who had made careers for themselves, who truly believed that you can make a side hustle your full-time job, and who have proven that you can, and who believed that we could as well, who believed in our idea. I think you're only going to mirror the things that people are telling you. So if you can surround yourself with people who support your goal, whatever that is, and in any goal, you need to be able to, if you're not going to be able to bring yourself out of the self-doubt, you need the people around you to do that. So I think it's very important to make sure that you curate very carefully, at least in the decision-making time, who you ask and what advice you take on board. And the other thing is, a tactic that's really, really helped me is just like, we're so fearful sometimes of confronting the bad side. Fear dominates us because we don't actually process it. What helps me is just to go, what is the actual worst case scenario? Like, confront the worst case scenario. Don't just ignore it and let it consume your mind. Actually think, what if it fails? Like, what is going to happen? And most of the time you'll realize it's not nearly as bad as you think. Most of the time, if it doesn't work, you can just go back to your job. Like, you might lose a little bit of money and you might look a little bit silly, but so much of the time, it's even the worst case scenario is not that bad. And suddenly that gives you a bit of perspective that the risk you're taking is maybe not as big as it feels. So I think there's a lot of mental work to do, but there are ways that you can make the whole jump a lot less scary than it actually seems.
Oh, that's such great advice.
This is 6 years later, though. I did not know all this back then.
And that's kind of key to what you just said right now, is look to the people that have taken that leap, have grown communities, have started businesses, because they'll tell you exactly what you need to hear. You can do it. You are going to learn all this stuff along the way. You don't need to have it all figured out right off the bat. It's going to be okay, right? Like, I love that advice.
Absolutely. And I think it making sure you've thought it through to the fact that to the worst case scenario and showing that even that is okay is a really big important mental step that we all skip. We're just like, oh, I can't think about the fear, I'm gonna just not do it, it's just easier. But yeah, genuinely, unless you're starting something that's like a huge tech app that needs $1 million to get off the ground, most side hustles don't. Most side hustles are much lower risk than you think. And you can do your job as well. Like, do some work on planning. Have a look at mind mapping and just writing down, can I keep my job for a little while? Can I do both? There's ways to make the risk very, very small.
Exactly. Now, growing communities, growing your business, scaling, I mean, growing alone is very hard on social media and whatnot. Building those communities, having that engagement with your community and making an impact, that's not something that comes easily, and it doesn't come overnight. So having done that yourself very well, what advice would you have for those that are currently in the growing stages looking to take that next leap?
That's a great question. I think it's a very difficult one because the things that have worked and not worked at different times change every day. So what worked for us at the beginning doesn't necessarily work now. But I think that's the key, is just constantly listening. There's so much, like, the digital landscape has allowed us to get so much real-time feedback from customers and followers and community members. They'll literally tell you when something is not serving them or they're missing certain information, and they'll tell you and show you when you do something that they love. So we've always just taken a really, in some areas in business, I think you need to be incredibly proactive, but in some you have to be really reactive. And in the area of building community, you just have to notice, like, what things get a lot of engagement, what posts at what times on what topics really excite your audience, and what things don't really work. And if something really works, do more of that. If something doesn't work, I think we overcomplicate things a lot. There's no one formula that's going to just help you explode. Unfortunately, Instagram has gone from being a very straightforward process to growth, where there were not really any convoluted algorithms. You could get to, the days of people getting to 1 million followers have kind of really stopped. But I also don't think you need that number anymore to get very high engagement. I think it's just picking what your brand values and voice is, being really consistent so that people can build trust and loyalty and know what to expect and can distinguish you from other people in a very busy landscape, and being willing to change with the constant changing landscape around you to make sure that you're always meeting their needs. And it's a lot of trial and error. I think there's no such thing, I was going to say even the experts, but there are no growth experts anymore, because even if they did become completely skilled and professional and made a career out of helping you grow, the landscape would change the next day. So everyone is actually learning on the go, which means it's more democratic than it's ever been, because anyone can kind of catch up. I think it's just, putting time into community growth is really important. And it's something that we wish happened organically. And of course it does happen organically, but I think you do have to actually put aside some time to make some decisions, to build a strategy, to decide which platforms you're going to use, which ones you aren't, why. Just make smart decisions. It doesn't have to cost you a lot. It also doesn't really have to take you that much time if you're just really efficient about it. And I think a lot of people start with this idea, and I definitely did, that you need to be on every platform. So you need Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, you need to be everywhere, Pinterest. You need to spend all the time on doing all those things, and then you don't do any of them well. I think depending on your industry, depending on the nature of your project, there are such clever ways to do a lot with very little, and a lot with very little time, but a lot with also very little money. A lot of the platforms are free, and there are lots of ways that you can get ahead. So there's also more information at your fingertips than there ever has been. So read widely, keep up on blogs, I think everything in business is self-learning or self-teaching. Listen to podcasts. There's people who are sharing their knowledge every day. So just put a little bit of time aside I know it's hard because you're working in the business and don't have as much time to work on it, but community building is the only way really that we became a thing and then continued to grow that thing and then have been able to pivot into new things, it's all because we spent a lot of time on community.
Yeah, that's such great advice. It's so true. It really comes down to the community and just focusing on that and being very strategic with your time and how you're spending it. And I love that you say you don't have to be everywhere, because a lot of people think that they do have to be on all these different platforms, but they don't align with what they're really trying to do, or they don't like those platforms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you don't only have Matcha Mated, you have other businesses, so I definitely want to hear about them as well. What prompted you to start Spoonful of Sarah and then Seize the Yay podcast on top of Matcha Maiden?
So this is interesting. It again came back to that whole subtle balance between proactively going, taking control of your direction and making plans and having big dreams, but also being a little bit reactive as well as you change and as you evolve and noticing stuff and then just tweaking your life as you go along. So I went from being a person who had 5 and 10 year plans that were not flexible. They were what I was going to do in the next 5 years, regardless of what happened in those in those years, regardless of whether I changed my mind, regardless of whether I learned things or didn't, to realizing you can't be that in this day and age. In some industries you can, but they're not very fast moving industries. In what I'd moved into, you need to be willing to change the plan every day, depending on what happens. So I kind of started to unlearn a lot of the old thinking that I had and really embrace the idea of constant change. And that involves a lot of unattaching to what you think the next year is going to look like. And so we kind of almost had a really big head start for COVID this year. I think business owners got hit really hard, but almost had a lot of practice at this level of uncertainty. And as part of that, I became much more observant of what was working for me and what wasn't, what I was good at. You mentioned earlier that there's a lot of a sense of obligation that if you're good at something, you should do it. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. You're not obliged to use talents that don't make you happy or maybe even make you actively unhappy to use. So I spent a lot of time like sorting out all the differences between what I want, what I like, what I'm good at, and just mind mapping all of that stuff. And one of the things I realized with Matcha was with both Matcha Maiden and the cafe that we opened, Matcha Milk Bar, my business partners were all men, which was made for an incredible partnership. They bring so many things to the table and perspectives that I didn't. But I was really missing the really fluffy feminine side of me that's quite dominant. If you've ever heard me, now you will have heard me speak, I'm super fluffy. I love to have a chat. I ramble a lot. I use fluffy words. I use words like yay. Not really anywhere to put that energy. But on top of that, there was also nowhere appropriate to share all the shitty bits. Like you can't really share on your business page that you had a breakdown yesterday and that's why orders aren't going out. It's just not appropriate and not very good for your sales strategy. But this was such a huge part of what I was going through that I was like, I want to talk about this because when I hear other people talk about that stuff, it's incredibly reassuring. So I'd always had my own page, but I didn't, do anything except share my breakfast on it. And I just started to put all the overspill of behind the scenes stuff on that page. So it was never really meant to be a business or be anything other than just kind of my like real-time journal of moving from one life to another. And that kind of almost became as popular as the business itself because so many other people wanted to hear that other people struggle and how they get through it, and that it's not all rosy, and that the polished outside is accompanied by all this other stuff under the surface, and that there's somewhere for all that content to live. And then the way that CZA became its own thing was that I had built such a strong way of communicating those ups and downs and the behind the scenes of having anxiety and burnout and self-doubt. But I was having conversations at things like speaking gigs with other business owners, and their stories were always quite similar. And they were usually stories that you would never imagine they would have if you only knew them from news articles or their Instagram or social media, that they also had no platform to share on, but that they seemed quite willing to talk about. So I was sort of like, oh, okay, the ingredients so far are conversations about stuff that doesn't have anywhere else to live. So it needs somewhere to go. I want to make them available to the people who are already listening to the stuff that I talk about, how I'm just such a basket case. podcast. Like that just makes sense. It's just the next logical like format or media to share all of these ideas. And again, like pretty much the same way Matcha Maiden happened, I was like, okay, I don't need to think about starting a huge media company. I just need to think about how do I make one episode.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's literally what I did. I just set about like, what do I need for one episode? I need a guest, I need a microphone, I need a computer and somewhere to record it into. And then I need somewhere for the podcast to live. I need a name, and that's it. I did it, I think 3 weeks later I launched, and that was 2 years ago.
Wow. That's
Again,
awesome.
super random.
But I mean, it's all like a natural progression, right? Like one thing led to another, to another, to another as you evolved and grew in this new path that you were taking.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that thing as well, that if I'd tried to start a podcast at the start, I wouldn't have known what to talk about, or I wouldn't have had all these revelations that I've had to talk about on it. So coming back to that whole staircase thing, it only made sense for it to come about years after the first transition, because it was the chapter I was ready for then.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me trust so deeply in the fact that there's still more chapters to come that I don't know what they are yet, and that I'm not meant to be there yet. And that's okay. I think we just need to give ourselves permission to be in steps that aren't the last one, because what's the point if you get there? We've already seen that people who get, like, there's a big existential crisis around success, because a lot of people get to their destination and then are like, I'm so unhappy, because what else is there? Mm-hmm. So I think if you don't ever embrace the journey, like there's no point in the destination.
Exactly. I love that you focus on the actual process, the journey, rather than the destination, because there's just so much more fun, so much more joy. There's so much more fulfillment in that than focusing solely on the end result.
Totally. And that's the problem with the end result model of thinking, is you inevitably one day you'll get there. So what are you going to do then? Mm-hmm. Like, unless the end result is something that you're constantly changing, which then kind of just becomes a journey anyway. Like, yeah. I think having said that, though, there have definitely been times where I was only focused on the end goal. And that's, I think, why I'm so aware of it now, is because that does really strip you of so much joy when the time comes, because nothing will ever be enough for you if you're only focusing on the end and not the process of getting there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you obviously, I mean, I have a podcast and a blog. I focus more so on the podcast right now, but that is a lot of work. Like finding guests, like researching them, doing all the invitations, coming up with your talking points, doing all the, like, the post production stuff, getting it promoted, like all that type of stuff is like a lot of work alone. And then you have the blog, and then you have Matcha Maiden. That is insane. So I would love to know what a typical day looks like for you. How do you organize yourself to stay on top of all of these different businesses? And, do you have some productivity tips to help others that are juggling many different responsibilities as well?
I think this is probably the area where I'm the least equipped to answer, because I'm still most of a work in progress. And that's the problem, right? When you love what you do, when you don't necessarily love your job, boundaries are a lot easier, because you kind of want to finish. You want to clock off at the end of the day. Well, as soon as you turn your passion into your profession, boundaries go out the window, which is actually it's amazing and fulfilling, but it's incredibly dangerous, because without boundaries, like, you inevitably, no one can go at 110% for very long. You might get like 3 amazing months out of yourself, and then you get 0 for the next 3 months. So I've only obviously learned that by actually going through that, and by continually burning out over and over, because I was like, what do you mean rest? Why do I need a weekend? I just want to work, work, work. It doesn't feel like work. And also you suddenly get the result of your work. In a company, you don't see those results. If you work an extra hour, like, there's no difference. But if you work an extra hour in your own business, you can actually see those results for yourself. So there's very little incentive to actually stop. So my biggest learning has been that to maintain any kind of productivity over an actual sustainable amount of time, rather than just a short burst, you actually need to slow down to speed up, which again is one of the stupidest things anyone's ever said to me. And I fully didn't believe it until I experienced the whole burnout thing and was like, oh, that's what you mean. You need to be really disciplined with your time. In fact, more so than you do when you're in a company, because those boundaries are kind of there for you. Like there are office hours, so they're already there. I thought that I'd leave business and have the most flexibility over my time, and I'd be this free agent who had no routine, and I'd love it. And it's actually really difficult for your body to operate without a routine, because how does it know when it's meant to be awake and energetic or not? So routine and kind of building in structure and rest and time off and distance from work before I need it, because when you know you need it, it's usually too late, has been the biggest breakthrough I've made. And you often don't feel like you need a break because you feel like you could go on forever. But you also notice that when you do take time off, your best ideas come after those breaks because you've had some distance. So I'm really, really strict now on how I build out my calendar. I've learnt to really observe. I think we're like our own science experiment. Everyone's ingredients for what makes a healthy, happy life is different. There's absolutely no point in blindly taking advice from other people. You just need to look at what works and what doesn't. And when you work for yourself, it's a total blank slate. There's no rules about what you do when. So for me, I know that for for example, I can't do one every day, but I have a lot of them to do. So I kind of block them together on days that I know are going to be for speaking, which means that that's when my body knows that that's a day I need to have that kind of energy. And then the next day I'll have a more quiet kind of computer day where I do editing or admin or the banking or, things that are not as conversational. And then I'll have another day that's outward facing and then another day that's inward facing. Whereas some people might do it the other way, where they have their meetings and stuff in the morning and then quiet time in the afternoon. I try and now quarantine weekends as much as possible. Sunday I call Sloth Sunday, which is to remind myself I'm meant to move as little as possible and just I'm like a really busy person in a lazy person's body. That's when I need to do nothing. I can't, even in my hobbies, I try and overachieve. I'm like, am I doing the best job at resting? Like, am I getting an A+ in resting? And I need to just detach from that kind of productivity. So anything that makes you forget what time it is, that's what the whole idea of play TA is in the book and the podcast, is like crime books, Netflix, like just indulge in the things that pull your brain completely away from work. That's been huge for actually me. I get much more done in the time that I'm productive because there's time when I know that I am not. So that's been, my biggest thing is to schedule in actively make time for downtime, whether or not you want it, stick to it rigidly, and then within the week experiment with what works with you and get rid of what doesn't. Just constantly tweak your recipe until you figure out what works. And there is too much of a good thing. There's such thing as overdoing even the positive things. So I used to learn, a really big thing, there's books on it, there's so much literature on the art of saying no. And I used to think it's so weird, but most humans have to learn how to say no to things they don't want to do. Like, it's so straightforward. You don't want to do something, say no. Why do we even need to learn how to do it? But for some reason, we're not very good at it. So you first have to learn to say no to things that you don't want to do. What's super hard is when you have to learn to say no to things you do want to do, because it's actually impossible to fit it all in, because there is so much available in life that you could pack your days full and only do things you want to do and still burn out. That was my most rude awakening. I'm still so offended that I don't have enough energy to do all the things that I want to do. But you have to get really selective. When you've got a lot going on, inevitably you're going to have to say no to some things because it's sacrifice. You can't fit it all in. So getting really strict on the limits of what you will allow into your week, because if you're fitting in everything but so tired that you can't enjoy it, or that you're not you're not good company when you actually go to things, what's the point of it?
100%. Protect your bubble.
Yes,
very
protect your
protective.
bubble.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I just took 15 minutes to say that, and all you needed to say was protect your bubble.
You said it so much better than me, though. It makes more sense coming from you than protect your bubble.
Not at all. I'm just oh God, I should have just said that from the start.
No. But it's so true. Be very protective over that bubble that you're in, right? Whatever you let in, make sure that it's a hell yes. Even if it's just a yes and you really want to do it, but there's still some hesitation, or you're just not sure how it's going to fit in or anything like that, just say no. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be a yes. Like, it's okay to say no. It can come back around later on when you have more time.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And or maybe like I think you can just say no, not now. You can just
Mm-hmm.
say, is it okay? Like most things are not urgent, and most people, if they really want the opportunity with you, are flexible. They only ask because it came into their mind right now. But with podcasts, for example, I've had so many guests who are like, I'd love to, but I just can't for the next few months because I'm finishing my book. And you're like, oh, well, it doesn't need to be in this 3 months. I would love to talk to you anytime. So it doesn't, like, no doesn't mean a forever permanent unbreakable no. It just can mean like when I have room, and you don't need to
Exactly.
feel guilty for that, because sometimes it actually suits them better to do it later as well.
Exactly. And I get that from guests too, where they're like, oh, sorry, right now we just can't fit it in. And I'm always like, okay, I'll reach out in X period of time. Maybe it'll be a better fit at that time, right? Like, no is not concrete. It's just no for right now.
Totally. And sometimes if you push it and you're like, no, I really want to look you in right now, you don't get as good an interview, or you don't get as good an
Mm-hmm.
experience, because that person's like, even if they're not actively resentful, they might just be exhausted. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
always like, oh, please tell me if it's not the right time. I would much prefer you to enjoy the experience and to then be more proud of the episode as well, because you've had a good time. And that's allowed me to give myself permission to do that in return, because I too don't want to. Why would I commit to someone and then disappoint them with being really uninteresting or inarticulate because I've mismanaged my energy? That's not their fault. So I
Mm-hmm.
think self-management is like the art of self-management. I definitely haven't mastered, but I continue to work on it, because that's how you get the best life out of yourself.
Totally. Now let's talk about the book, Seize the Yay. Were you always wanting to write a book? Was this something that just kind of happened along the process where you're like, oh, maybe I'll write a book. Maybe this is the right time. What was that whole experience like for you? Did you enjoy it?
A bit of both. It was a bit of, I've always wanted to write a book. The part of law that I probably loved the most was writing and forming concepts and arguments and using language. And all my arts degree was language subjects. I love learning languages. So I always had it in my mind that I would write something long form.
Mhm.
I don't, again, like I've become a lot more patient with when the right thing comes up. So I wasn't necessarily trying to just churn out a book. I think I just sort of had it in on the horizon somewhere. And if I'd tried to write it a day earlier than the day I actually did, I would have not known what to say. But by the time it came around, I think the universe has really amazing timing. I had 18 months of the podcast, so like 75 conversations or something like that, that had opened my mind to everything I wanted to write about. And I just had it all ready to just word diarrhea out of my mouth. And it came from a publisher a week after we got married. And the opportunity was, if you want your book to come out September this year, I had from the end of November to the 1st of January to write the whole book. But that also worked out really well, because I need a deadline to actually finish anything. So I wrote it in like a very short amount of time, but the timing was so perfect because I had it all sitting in my brain. And it was the sort of offer from a publisher that tipped me over to like, well, if I have an offer, of course I'm going to write a book. And of course I'm going to call it Seize the A. And of course it's going to cover all these topics that I always cover in every conversation. So it all just flowed really, really well, and allowed me to also learn about myself. And I kind of probably could have guessed this from just how I studied for uni exams and stuff, but I'm better anyway when I have a really short amount of time. I wouldn't have wanted the book to go over a year, because I would have just edited it over and over again and then probably ended up undoing all the edits and going back to how it was at the start. Like I just
Mhm.
need to have that kind of done is better than perfect thing, like pushing me to just do it. And then it worked out that the whole book is about embracing discomfort and uncertainty and accepting that beautiful new beginnings are disguised as painful endings a lot of the time. And then it came out in the middle of a pandemic. I was like, how
Perfect
could I
timing.
have known that I was writing for this exact situation? How to find your joy amidst loss and, heartache and pain and grief and adversity, and
Mhm.
how to find joy in the moments and clear slate and stop doing things because you should, or because you don't know anything else, or because you're too scared of doing anything different. You know, when it came out, I was like, geez, like, thank you, heavens, for figuring this timing out in this exact way.
Everything works out for the perfect timing. You just have to allow yourself to kind of just let it be and to flow with the motion.
Totally. Absolutely. And I think it's like, you know, some of my friends often say to me, well, it's easy for you to say because things always work out for you. And I'm like, well, it's because when timing does come, it might not actually be the perfect time for me, but because I have that mindset towards it happening for a reason, I'll make the most of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings another quote up to me. It's like, happy people don't have the best of everything. They make the best of everything. So things often in hindsight look like I've had the perfect timing, but if I could choose the timing, it wouldn't, so many things wouldn't have happened that way. I wouldn't have gotten sick and written myself off for 6 months, you know, all of those things wouldn't have happened if I had a choice. But once they did happen, I could accept that, just trust the process and be like, okay, this is happening because, you know, I think we often have the illusion that if things were going to be different, they would have been better, but we never consider the possibility that things could have been worse. So when things that are bad that happen, we're like, oh, but you know, this stopped me from doing this year and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, actually, this could have saved you from much worse luck.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, no matter what comes your way, just choose the spin you put on it. And the events are not going to change, but the way you approach them and react to them is what controls your life.
Totally. That is words to live by, 100%. Now, last question. If anybody wants to learn more about you, where do you hang out the most? Where can we connect with you? Where can we find your podcast?
Oh, I hang out a lot on Instagram. So Spoonful of Sarah, links to all the other pages. But Seize the Yay has its own page. We have a little Facebook community that's called the Yayborhood, where we talk about the latest episodes. There's giveaways. We talk about the book. There's like happy little quotes that everyone shares, like things that made their day. That's a really fun place to hang out. The podcast is anywhere you get your podcasts. The book is anywhere you get good books. Booktopia, Amazon, Book Depository if you're looking online. And I am very regular visitor of the interwebs, so you can find me most of the time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time to share your incredible entrepreneurial journey, for giving us your advice on how we can take that leap from side hustle to full time and create an impact in our communities. I know so many are going to benefit from this conversation and learning from your experience. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
I'm Jessica, and thanks for tuning in today to Love Unplugged, the podcast. If there are any questions or topics you'd love answered on the show, head on over to www.projectloveco.com and share your request with me. If you haven't yet, go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast and share it with a loved one. Your feedback means the world to me, and the community we've created is what fuels our discussions here. After all, this is all for you. Join me next time for another unplugged conversation.